It's November 1938. Roland Thaxter Bird is standing in front of the display window of an Indian trading post in the town of Gallup, New Mexico. Roland works for the Department of Vertebrate Paleontology for the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, but such a prestigious role belies the man's true character. Just a few years earlier, Roland was a drifter, wandering the American West, living out of a compact trailer hitched to the side of his rusty Harley. Despite a sharp mind, childhood illness forced him to drop out of high school. Life had delivered Roland few prospects until in 1932 he stumbled upon a fossilized jaw that would land him in the office of the most famous fossil hunter of all time, Barnum Brown. Now in his 60s, Barnum was, in a way, a dinosaur himself. Barnum is better understood not as a paleontologist as we now know the word, but as a transitional fossil between Victorian-era treasure hunters and dedicated academics. While Barnum took care to document a lot of his work, he was still really close friends with dynamite. He had spent decades wandering America trading for fossils. He spent years just floating down Alberta's Red Deer River, stopping to dig anywhere that looked promising. And as paleontology matured, the image of Barnum out in the field wearing a massive fur coat just felt, even by 1930, anachronistic. The Department of Vertebrate Paleontology was no longer staffed by fossil hunters, but rather with career academics. Barnum looked at Roland and saw a fossil hunter, someone who could read a map, identify safe drinking water, someone that Barnum could send out west and expect to come back alive. Barnum offered Roland a job on the spot and spent the following years mentoring him. As Roland described it, Barnum Brown's tutorage was worth more than a millionaire could afford. So, after several years of shadowing Barnum, this 1938 season was Roland's first solo mission. Barnum had given him a stack of loose leads and a few odd jobs and let him loose on virgin territory, trading out Roland's motorcycle for a beat-up 1929 Buick belonging to the museum. Roland was desperate to make this chance count. He craved the opportunity to bring back something, anything, that he could drop on a desk and prove himself to his idol. And after several months out in the field, it had amounted to nothing. He now found himself in Gallup, New Mexico, picking up a fossilized plant that had been donated to the museum, one last odd job to make the most out of his time out west. While making conversation, a local resident told Roland to swing by Jack Hill's trading post.
Got some of the damnedest tracks in stone ever I seen. Looked like they was made by a man maybe 12 feet high.
Out here, Roland was always hearing stories of wonders elsewhere. Locals all had some spectacular story they picked up from some fella, but this was a first. The footprints of the 12-foot man were just a short walk from Roland's hotel. The weather that night had taken a turn and it was now snowing. Roland was looking through the showcase window at two large rock slabs. What he hoped to be looking at was an ancient footprint of a prehistoric bear, but obscured by snow, Roland couldn't make anything out of the footprints. He avoided lingering by the window for too long for fear of arousing the store clerk. After moving on and making a second casual pass, Roland found the courage to step inside. As he approached the slabs, he was disappointed. By excavating these footprints onto separate slabs, it was now impossible to measure the stride of the prints. That would make Roland's job harder and ultimately destroy a lot of the scientific value. However, any anxiety about scientific value was quickly dispelled.
Do you know of anything? Have you ever seen anything that looked like that before?
I'm afraid your Jack Hill has found himself a pair of fake footprints.
Instead of bear prints or fossils of any kind, someone had taken these rocks and chiseled a caricature of human footprint into them. Why? Who cares? For the fun of it, perhaps. To scam a gullible traveler, maybe. It didn't much matter. This was of no value to Roland.
Who's been carving these things out of stone to fool people?
I don't know much about them. All I know, they come from Glen Rose, Texas. Mr. Hill brought them west a couple weeks ago with some dinosaur footprints.
Dinosaur footprints? Now that's interesting. Could those be fakes as well? Roland had never encountered fake dinosaur footprints before. In hindsight, it seems like an obvious grift. But regardless, if the prints were genuine, Roland might have his trophy after all. And if they're also carvings, well, at least it would be interesting. The dinosaur prints were at Jack Hill's second store in Lupton, what is now a 20-minute drive away. Roland drove out into the snowy night to see these dinosaur prints, and when he arrived at the store, he found that the prints were pristine. Don't misunderstand, they were also obvious carvings, but the size and proportions were absolutely perfect. The human footprints were cartoonish, resembling the artist's guess at what a human footprint would look like. These dinosaur tracks were a different story. They were so good that the creator must have been working from a reference. The next morning, Roland consulted his maps. The museum had never been to Glen Rose. The geologic map suggested a strong possibility of dinosaur tracks, and no one was waiting for him back in New York. Screw it. Roland hit the road.
O river, Paluxy, revealer of history, no longer a mystery, those footprints in stone, both man and dinosaur, roamed on your ancient shore, river, Paluxy, revealer of history.
During the Lower Cretaceous, this was all part of a massive, shallow continental shelf spanning from South Florida to Mexico. We know this in part because of the limestone I'm standing on. When marine organisms like coral and shrimp die, their remains, which contain a lot of calcium carbonate, break down into a firm lime mud. And while this whole area was often underwater, it was shallow enough for dinosaurs to cross, and the lime mud was an ideal surface for them to leave impressions in. But what's unique about this formation is that freshwater streams would also deliver other forms of sediments, covering the lime mud with silt and clay, which would fill in the footprints, preserving those impressions. So as this went on and the sediment was compacted, the lime mud developed into limestone, while the silt developed into clay and marl. Millions of years later, what we're left with is this, the Glen Rose Formation, an expanse of rock 20 feet deep with alternating layers of solid limestone and softer, friable clay. And this river, the Paluxy, has spent hundreds of years carving through the rock, exposing some of the most spectacular dinosaur footprints in the world. Upon arriving in Glen Rose and lacking a plan, Bird heads to the center of town, the local courthouse. As he approaches it, he spots something out of the corner of his eye. He sees that.
It was a beauty, and there was no doubt that it was genuine. It was all 20 inches of footprint perfection, made by a three-toed carnivore in mud which had faithfully preserved every minute detail. A slab of such prints alone would be a fine addition to any museum collection.
A fine addition to any museum collection, and here it was, being used as masonry. Because as it turns out, the locals didn't really think that much of it. Apparently, there were loads of similar prints down by the river. After asking around, Bird was given the name of James Riles. The poor bastard was known to chisel these footprints out of the riverbed and try to sell them to anyone who'd pay. If anyone could show Roland around, it was him.
I've had a heap of fun at it. I don't put too much food on the table, but then, what does? Hereabouts, about the only money-making jobs is cutting cedar posts, bootlegging, and quarrying dinosaur footprints. And the other two is hard work. Cutting out dino tracks is hard enough, but it's a heap cooler.
The two met and Riles agreed to show him around. Because it was November, months removed from the dry season, most of the footprints were underwater and filled with silt, but James still managed to show Roland some of the best quality footprints he had ever seen. Then, in conversation, Roland alluded to the strange footprints he had seen in Jack Hill's store. Riles immediately perked up.
Oh, you mean the Mantracks?
Let's talk about footprints for a bit. Looking again at those carved footprints from Gallup, they resemble a human foot, but not a human footprint. On hard surfaces, your footprint won't be a perfect representation of your foot, but rather a reflection of what parts of your foot were contacting the ground and bearing the most weight. So your big toe, which you rely on to push off the ground, presses down and has a visible connection to the ball of your foot, whereas your little toes, who are freeloaders, curl up and only leave an impression of their pads. In mud, your foot will sink further into the ground, giving a more complete look, but it will retain those anatomical details, and the depth of the print will do a lot to communicate the shape of the foot. For instance, your little toes will still curl, but the rest of the toe will dig into the mud, creating a clear elevation between the pad and ball. Even if we ignore their obvious giant size, the slabs from Gallup have numerous errors that you can recognize intuitively. The toes are far too long, the big toe is too narrow, and its depression is far too deep. The ball of the foot is too wide, while the heel of the foot is too narrow. These errors compound to give the print a harsh, triangular shape. The arch is disproportionate, and the ball is misshapen. We could go on. It's plainly awful. As Laurie Godfrey, Emeritus Professor of Anthropology, put it, the creator was clearly using the top of his foot as the reference rather than the bottom. The sculptor made the print extremely detailed because they wanted it to be high quality, but in that detail gives us the tools to prove it's inauthentic. James Ryle's invocation of Mantracks was too inviting a phrase not to pursue. Ryles led Roland on a brief walk, stopping to show him the pits where he had quarried footprints from the riverbed. Stopping at a shallow hole by the edge of the river, Ryles sloshed his shovel back and forth to stir the silt and let the current wash it clean. The water revealed an ill-defined oblong print, 15 inches long, having clearly been made in soft mud that had collapsed before it was preserved. It was too vague to take any information from. This got Ryles talking about all the tracks that had been lost to erosion, all the tracks that had been destroyed in floods over the years.
Too bad. There used to be some fine things under those stones. I wish you could have seen them.
What did the tracks look like?
Some was rounded like, others was bigger and longer.
Any claws? Did they show any signs of claws?
The big ones did. The little rounded ones, no.
James Ryles is describing sauropod footprints. Roland fought to keep himself calm. These tridactyl theropod prints were one thing, a valuable find but common as far as fossilized dinosaur prints go. Sauropod prints, however, were a whole different ballgame. The only sauropod prints discovered up to now were vague and undefined. If Roland could find a sauropod print in this limestone, that was the fantasy, but the realistic path forward was to uncover and document a high-quality run of three-toed dinosaur prints. While that might not make history, it would be a valuable addition to the museum's collection. Over the next few days, Roland got to work with a pick, shovel, and broom. He found a run with a footprint so pristine that it had preserved the curl in the dinosaur's claw. It's hard to imagine doing better than that. Roland cleaned the print, got his photos, and did his documentation. After a quick sandwich, it was time to go. But Barnum had a rule: always dig 3 feet beyond. You might just get lucky. So Roland wandered along the river, digging his 3 feet in spirit if not in action. He soon found himself standing in front of a sizable pothole up on the ledge running above the river. It looked like a simple cavity in the rock, but there was something odd about it. Roland started digging, shoveling dirt into the stream until his plate rang sharply against a margin in the depression. Clearing the dirt, Roland was standing in a 3-foot-long sauropod footprint, the right hind foot. But as we already know, a footprint is one thing, a series of tracks is another thing entirely. As it turns out, Bird didn't find one print, he found 3, each demonstrating the necessary 4 toes, each reinforcing the authenticity of the others. These sauropod tracks were the best ever documented, but they were already exposed and weather-worn. As valuable as they may be, their true value was as evidence of further tracks that remain under the rock. So Roland took a cast of the right hind foot and returned to New York, trophy in hand, eager to lead a full excavation on the Paluxy River. Roland would get the opportunity to write about this whole episode, from the carvings in Gallup to the man-like tracks shown to him by Ryles to his sauropod discovery in an article for Natural History in 1939. It was from this area right behind me that Roland Bird excavated over 100 feet of trackway in 1941, a trackway that is still on display to this day in the Museum of Natural History in New York, New York. James Ryles did not have an easy life. A father to 8 children, anyone would struggle to put enough food on the table, but James was a farmer in Glen Rose, Texas, a uniquely harsh situation. Agriculture was historically the dominant industry in Glen Rose, but the region wasn't great for agriculture. A reliance on cotton, poor farming techniques, and completely unorganized flood control measures all depleted the soil, sending the county's agriculture into steep decline by the First World War. By the Great Depression, it wasn't enough for James simply to own a farm. He needed to earn more money, and he opted to chisel dinosaur tracks out of the Paluxy riverbed to sell to whoever would pay. So after the chores were finished on the farm, James and his wife Cecil would head down to the river. Wielding a chisel made from the axle of an old Model T and an 8-pound sledgehammer, the two would get to work. He would hold the chisel, she would swing the hammer. Depending on the conditions, the trace fossil could take between a few hours and a week to extract from the surrounding rock. A dinosaur footprint could sell anywhere from $25 to $50. Dinosaur tracks in the Paluxy River were first documented in early 1909 when a 9-year-old boy named George Adams discovered an oddly shaped depression in the riverbed.
And he had skipped school that day, and there had been a flood in the area, and he decided to go exploring on the local creek here. He found at the time he didn't know, a dinosaur track. I'm Dennis Moore. I'm the curator of the Somerville County Historical Society Museum here in Glen Rose. And so I guess he had to go back the next day. So I skipped school, and Mr. McDonald, the teacher, went out either that day or the next day and said, this is a dinosaur track. So we give George Adams the credit for first getting the dinosaur tracks identified.
The story made the local papers and drew in a few interested folk from neighboring villages. That same year, George's brother, the 22-year-old Ernest Adams, was walking the river with a 15-year-old named Charlie Moss when Ernest Adams discovered a series of elongated tracks in the riverbed, unlike the three-toed prints his brother saw. Ernest declares them to be giant man tracks and goes so far as to name his new species Texanus gargantuus, a prehistoric giant human. With the benefit of a century of hindsight, it's hard to ignore the circumstances around this supposed discovery. Ernest is a man of local legend. To quote the cover copy of his biography, Ernest T. Bull Adams was the first ever Rhodes Scholar from Baylor University, but he spent most of his adult years on his knees sifting through the dirt as he unearthed clues about the earliest humans. He was a formidably brilliant lawyer and apt public official, yet he tender-heartedly devoted much of his professional career to representing the down and out. Blessed with Herculean physical prowess that earned him his nickname, this gentle giant was most at home while he entranced youngsters from his hometown in Glen Rose, Texas, with yarns about his rugged, enigmatic life. This paints the picture of a man dedicated to being the smartest guy in town, if not the entire state of Texas. To be blunt, it's really easy to imagine Ernest's ego being threatened by his 9-year-old brother's discovery and immediately setting out to one-up him. Regardless of Ernest's motivations, the story and the giant man tracks became something of a local myth. Yes, sir, our Ernest is one of the smartest men in Texas. Did you know he discovered giant human footprints down in the riverbed? Tall tales like this were a dime a dozen out west. Small towns had social hierarchies, complex family dynamics, and a lot of boredom. So when something interesting happened, it was really interesting. Human footprints in the riverbed didn't just make Ernest unique, it made Glen Rose unique. The myth was aided by the fact that these tracks, once exposed, became very fragile. Neither of these trails were ever documented, and they were lost to the Paluxy's infamous flooding. Prior to the 1940s, Texas had no unified plan for water management. Farmers instituted flood control measures as they saw fit, and the unorganized mess caused floods to wreak havoc in the region. Flooding on the Paluxy River was severe enough to tear up the limestone layers of the riverbed, destroying any tracks and carrying the debris downstream, dumping it into massive piles of stone slabs. At some point in the 1930s, deep in the Great Depression, a now adult George Adams looked upon one of these piles of stone and had an idea. While James Riles toiled under the hot sun, chiseling and torquing limestone out of a riverbed, George blazed his own trail. He picked a good slab out of a pile, preferably one that already had a nice depression in it, took it to a shady tree and sat beneath it, finally chiseling a footprint into the slab. It was easier work for a higher quality product, all on a schedule convenient to him. Upon completing the carving, he would treat the print with hydrochloric acid to dull the chisel marks before covering the slab in manure for several days to give the track the appearance of a uniform age. These dinosaur tracks sold on loose slabs were something of a cottage industry in Glen Rose, and it's impossible to know precisely how many were genuine versus carvings. These weren't great acts of deception. The slabs were sold to tourists or local residents, typically ending up as garden ornaments. And look, this was Glen Rose in the Great Depression. If some passerby on their way to California could afford to part ways with $25 whole for a novelty stone slab, that money was better off with George Adams anyway. Many residents may have gotten a piece of this pie, but what made George noteworthy wasn't that he carved, it was what he carved. You had the classic tridactyl prints that he discovered as a child, but he also carved tracks of the saber-toothed tiger, and most critically, a giant human footprint matching the dimensions of Ernest's Texanus gargantuus. But the giant man tracks weren't as popular as the dinosaur tracks, typically going for around half the price. Whether this is because giant humans were less interesting than dinosaurs or because they were more obviously fake, who knows? But it was one of these sets of man tracks that found its way to Jack Hill's store in Gallup, New Mexico, where they were presented as genuine. It was there that, by sheer coincidence, they would be encountered by an assistant to history's most famous fossil hunter. If it weren't for that encounter and Roland Bird's dramatic account of them in his natural history article, these slabs would be entirely forgotten outside of Glen Rose. But within Glen Rose, the story is remembered. George Adams was the local mailman who sold a few carved footprints to survive the Great Depression. We only know of him because his family and community worked to preserve his memory. And sometimes those stories get a little distorted. They add a little narrative flair. They become exaggerated in the way that all stories do. Sometimes facts alone can't convey how much a person meant to their community. So, while Ernest Adams certainly did not discover giant human footprints in the Paluxy riverbed, the story offers countless insights into the lives and history of this village, a history that is both unimportant and invaluable. So let's just take a second to appreciate all this and listen to Mary Adams, Ernest's daughter, recount her father's life.
His most outstanding contribution, however, was his finding of footprints of man and dinosaur tracks in the same geologic strata in the Paluxy River. This confirms the biblical account of creation as stated in Genesis. This finding also disproves the theory of evolution, which claims that the dinosaur was extinct for 55 million years before man, quote, evolved.
Sorry, what was that about Genesis? Have you ever noticed how creationists seem to love dinosaurs? You might think that the discovery of dinosaurs would have wreaked havoc on Christianity, striking out huge portions of the Bible and sending churches all across the nation into chaos. But as it turns out, when dinosaurs first started being discovered, many denominations were extremely cool with them. As early as 1902, the Seventh-day Adventist newspaper, Signs of the Times, was publishing articles and essays on the subject of dinosaurs, both discussing their theological implications, but also just geeking out about dinosaurs. This niche was spearheaded by a man named George McCready Price, a devoted Adventist who loved himself a dinosaur. Price's faith wasn't just unthreatened by dinosaurs, he argued that they were proof of biblical authority. We're finding the buried remains of all of these creatures that no longer inhabit the world. What could have caused it? Well, it's obvious. The Genesis flood, the one with Noah and the Ark. Price would develop this thought, resulting in the theory of flood geology, claiming the geology of the Earth as it exists today. The continents, mountain ranges, canyons, soil composition, the whole lot, all result from Noah's flood, a paradigm where geology has 2 points in history, pre- and post-flood. It follows that all fossilized organisms that are uncovered were victims of the flood. This theory necessitates that all fossilized creatures were wiped out in the same extinction event, and they must have existed contemporaneously pre-flood. That means that dinosaurs must have existed pre-flood alongside humanity. The point of this theory is to provide support to a literal interpretation of the Bible. So while it's not a necessary component of flood geology, one of the theory's core tenets is that the Earth is only about 6,000 to 10,000 years old, reflecting biblical history. And as of 1940, all of this was not popular. Even within evangelical circles of the early 20th century, this was perceived as crank. But one of the few people who did believe in flood geology was a man named Clifford Burdick. A geologist from Tucson, Arizona, at first glance Burdick looks and behaves like your standard crank or quack from this era. He spent his life lying about his education, he was most comfortable applying his science out west far from peer review, and like a quack doctor, you trusted his diagnosis at your own peril. But despite seeming like a perfect fit for your John R. Brinkley archetype, he differs in one essential aspect. Clifford Burdick never met a theory he couldn't believe.
Dr. Clifford Burdick has been to Mount Ararat 4 times. He failed to locate Noah's Ark, but his scientific mind recognized other clues.
Burdick was an advocate of flood geology, yet he would go on to become flood geology's greatest enemy by the sheer force of his passionate incompetence. A man so easily misled and so convinced in his erroneous beliefs that even his staunchest allies would come to fear him. Trusting Burdick on anything was to risk utter humiliation. Okay, so for our purposes, Burdick comes onto the scene in the 40s, but to illustrate just what kind of a guy he was, just the way in which the man was a prototype fox mulder who just wanted to believe, let's skip ahead for a minute to the 70s and talk about the Moab skeleton. In 1971, a man named Lynn Ottinger discovered major portions of 2 human skeletons in the Keystone Azurite mine in Moab, Utah. Within days, archaeologist John Marrott was brought in to document and investigate the find. The remains were found in loose blow sand, which was near but entirely distinct from the hard sandstone around the remains. For Marrott, this was unquestionably a Native American burial only a few hundred years old. But Marrott was accompanied by a freelance writer, Fran Barnes, who reported on the discovery in the local newspaper, putting a very familiar spin on this whole situation. You know how this goes. Because the bones were found near 100 million year old rock, the bones were 100 million years old. Checkmate evolutionists. Clifford Burdick read this news report and published his own article in 1973 based solely on the claims of Barnes and Ottinger, distorting the data to really drive the idea that these were fossilized human remains found within Cretaceous rock, just like a dinosaur fossil. Burdick pushed this claim for over a decade, making the Moab skeleton a very big deal to an incredibly small group of creationists. Ottinger began showcasing the bones at numerous creationist events, and it was the star attraction of the Bible Science Association meeting held in Glen Rose in 1983. Despite Marwood's stating of the skeleton being quite well known, an attendee was willing to pay $10,000 for the Moab skeleton. It's probably lost some value after 1989 when UCLA carried out carbon dating on a sample and confirmed that the remains were only about 200 years old. You could say he got boned by that one. But before all that, in 1943, Burdick was a member of the Deluge Geology Society in Los Angeles, one of the many attempts at establishing an organization that would take flood geology seriously. Burdick is assigned to a team focused on finding evidence of human coexistence with dinosaurs. Flood geology has countless bugbears, but its 2 foundational concerns are the age of the Earth and the concept of evolution. If humans could be shown to have coexisted with dinosaurs, then evolution as we know it is cooked, and it would raise doubts about the geological timeline. Clifford and his friends took an interest in Bird's natural history article. They wanted to see Ryle's Mantracks from the riverbed with their own eyes and conduct a legitimate excavation of the river to see if the tracks were genuine. After years of failing to raise funds, the project was quietly forgotten, but Clifford Burdick didn't forget. He ventured out solo to conduct his own investigation and was immediately sidetracked. Burdick was seemingly able to trace the carved Mantracks birds saw in Gallup to their new owner, the operator of a roadside museum in Arizona named Alan Berry. Upon inspection, Burdick became convinced that the prints were genuine, and thus these tracks were the same man-like tracks birds saw in the riverbed. This would cause Burdick to fixate on Mantracks, making numerous sporadic trips to Glen Rose over the next 40 years. In 1950, Burdick would publish an article in Signs of the Times where he made his ultimate argument. Humans did not evolve. In fact, we have degenerated. Not only has man decreased in stature... Wait, what does Burdick sound like?
We did find many evidences. We were very surprised about what we did find that supported the theory that there was an ark.
Okay then. Not only has man decreased in stature from a magnificent specimen 10 or 12 feet tall to an average today of less than 6 feet, but his average life has shortened from many centuries to little more than half a century. Where do we find any human evolution here? Burdick claims that Roland saw so many human tracks that it was impossible to deny their existence, but wouldn't you know it, the tracks have all been quarried and sold off. He took this rhetoric further in 1955 with a second article. Burdick bends and distorts Roland's account to an extent that even the sloppiest hack journalist wouldn't dare to try today. Burdick combines, rearranges, and outright rewrites different portions of the natural history article to completely reframe Bird's motivations.
This put things in an entirely new light. Even the possibility of such an association,
Dinosaur and human,
seemed incredible. The surroundings were Lower Cretaceous in age, rock exposures roughly 120 million years old. Very definitely the age of reptiles. Could I have been mistaken in my first conclusions? I am afraid Mr. Hill has found himself a pair of fake footprints.
As Burdick tells it, Roland saw the Mantracks in Gallup and was so blown away, so terrified by the significance of this discovery and its consequences for Darwinian evolution, that he raced to Glen Rose to confirm their authenticity. Then Ryle's mystery footprint was so perfect that it caused Roland to have an existential crisis. His dogmatic belief in evolution was being shattered by the Paluxy River, and it was easier to deny than accept the reality of biblical creation. Bird would be made aware of these articles, and while he was outraged at being so misrepresented, he ultimately viewed it as harmless. Signs of the Times was a niche Adventist newspaper, and he had better things to be doing. But Clifford Burdick had just opened the Genesis floodgates.
We did find many evidences. We were very surprised about what we did find that supported the theory that there was an ark, and because that the mountain was covered with water at one time. And this is one of the evidences. We found great bodies of salt at 6,000 feet, which indicate that the water was much higher than 6,000 feet at one time.
In 1961, seminarian John C. Whitcomb Jr. and hydraulic engineer Henry M. Morris released their landmark creationist book, The Genesis Flood. In the book, Whitcomb and Morris make their scientific argument for flood geology and young Earth creationism. By this point in the 1960s, there had been a 2-decade movement of evangelical scientists trying to reconcile modern science with biblical authority, which was itself built on hundreds of years of apologetics. But a schism was forming. In the mainstream, this manifested in a growing support for liberal theology, a school of thought which allowed for the Bible to be interpreted as a complicated and nuanced collection of ancient literature with its own historical contexts. A great example is day-age theory, which argued that the days in Genesis were metaphoric, each day referring to millions or even billions of years. This allowed for the existence of old Earth creationists, evangelicals who could accept the true age of the Earth without it threatening their beliefs. But flood geology is a product of Christian fundamentalism. The doctrine of biblical inerrancy does not permit something like day-age theory. The Bible says creation took 6 days, so the Earth was created in 6 literal 24-hour days, and the Earth itself is around 6,000 years old. Young Earth creationists had, by 1960, spent 20 years trying and failing to make a convincing scientific argument to their evangelical peers. It's not really an exaggeration to say that they had been bullied out of the room. The thing is that this entire subject had already had its day in court. God-fearing natural philosophers and later geologists took the theory very seriously in the 17 and 1800s. The idea that fossils and geologic layers were artifacts left behind by Noah's flood was one of the first theories proposed. The biblical account of creation was by and large the default supposition that other theories were competing against, and it was systematically discarded over the course of 200 years as the evidence across dozens of scientific disciplines simply didn't support it. Saying that George McCready Price developed the concept of flood geology that Whitcomb and Morris then ran with is not strictly inaccurate, but the more nuanced version would be to say that by being a combination of ignorant and dismissive of the work that had already been done by his own predecessors, Price reinvented an already debunked theory. And the Genesis flood is no different. It is pure pseudoscience constructed entirely of motivated reasoning. Neither Morris nor Whitcomb have a background in geology, which causes some problems in their scientific argument for flood geology. The resulting work was so poor, so misleading, that it prompted an 11,000-word response from an Adventist geology professor.
It is almost incredible that such an effort, which must have cost an enormous amount of work and money, has been made for such a bad procedure as this.
But despite his scathing critique of their science, his foundational critique remained spiritual in nature.
The most tragic aspect of the fundamentalist conception seems to me that his standpoint requires scientific proof, so that he must somehow live in fear of the results of developing scientific work, because indeed this development could then also disprove the reliability of the Holy Scriptures.
This alludes to a cognitive dissonance within many evangelicals who were growing increasingly anxious in the technological and social turmoil of the 20th century. The church was losing its unofficial but otherwise functional position of supreme authority, and political policies like Jim Crow, tenuously justified by appeals to scripture, were in the process of being torn down. These groups clung to biblical literalism because if you cede that some parts are abstract or poetic or only relevant within a historical context, then the entire Bible is open to such challenges. And if you use the Bible as the justification for monstrous policies, obviously those policies are going to be the first to be challenged. That audience, evangelical laymen, were the real target audience of the Genesis flood. The purpose of the book was not to win over stuffy Adventist academics or Presbyterian journalists, but to provide a comforting narrative to everyday churchgoers. No metaphorical interpretation, no backsliding or unanswered questions. It is in this environment that the Protestant belief that Scripture should be accessible to the laity metastasizes into full anti-intellectualism. The belief that the shallowest, least informed reading is not merely worth discussion, but is in fact more legitimate. This is where we get the theology of Kent Hovind, where primacy is given to a childish and strictly literal interpretation that presents the Bible as a single, unified text authored by God from end to end in its current form for the enlightenment of English-speaking modern white evangelical Protestants in the American South.
If what you're proposing is true, then there is no possible way the average person in the world can read this book and understand it. The God that I worship wrote a book that anybody can read and understand the vast majority of it, and this book clearly says God made everything in 6 days. They were days just like we have today. I think the Big Bang Theory is one of the most ridiculous ideas I've ever heard of in the world, and I think we'll have an interesting discussion on that tonight. I think if you gave this book to 5,000 people and said, read this, tell me what it says, all 5,000 would come back and say, this is saying he made it in 6 days.
This simplistic theology creates an equally simplistic geology. Things are what they look like to a child. If a child would conclude that the Grand Canyon was carved by the receding waters of the flood, then any argument otherwise was just muddying the waters. The Genesis flood sets out to correct the growing dissonance between science and the Bible by arguing that science was in fact correct and useful and was responsible for the myriad technological innovations of the modern age. It was scientists and their interpretations who couldn't be trusted. The shift is the argument that the science actually proves the Bible and has all along, but scientists, either blinded by their secularism or perhaps willfully corrupt, were obfuscating that. The faithful had the real science. The Genesis flood suggests that there is no conflict between science and the Bible because they are the same, and thus the litmus test for any conclusion is agreement with the Scripture. In a single stroke, it is thus able to depoliticize religion, imbuing it with the perceived objectivity of science, and from that, inheriting its authority. Science in this context is not a system of iterative theories and tests and investigations and predictions, but a mythology, a twin sibling of religion, with an authority that can simply be claimed by performing its rites and rituals. The book is the passion play performance of the idea of science, the vocabulary and aesthetics flattened into a simple, unambiguous fable. What's more, that performance is easy. It's so simple, a child could do it. Within the context of evangelicalism, the Genesis flood was tectonic. It transformed young Earth creationism from an obscure, long-debunked doctrine into something with broad appeal. Readers didn't need to understand it, they didn't even need to read it, they just needed to accept it. The Genesis flood was quoted in church. Creationist organizations would be built around the book, and it has been a staple of the evangelical homeschooling curriculum for going on 60 years. It energized an entire movement of fundamentalists to put on lab coats or whip together a volunteer field expedition and perform some science to affirm the Bible. And one of the book's most spectacular revelations was the coexistence of man and dinosaur, and their evidence for this was the Gallup slabs, authenticated by none other than paleontologist Roland T. Bird, according to Clifford Burdick.
Basically, there are two major views. One, origin by evolution. Two, origin by special creation.
In 1968, Reverend Stanley Taylor traveled to Glen Rose, Texas. Taylor ran a small evangelical film production house. He'd read the Genesis flood and wanted to see these tracks for himself. He invited Clifford Burdick to meet him in Glen Rose to show him the tracks and document the footprints as part of a proposed film. For Burdick, this was a question of restoring credibility. Burdick was adept at tracking down Mantracks on loose slabs and had started his own collection of the specimens that he claimed to be genuine trace fossils. This included a pair of human feet that have come to be known as the Burdick slabs, which he claims to have bought from a reverend in Arizona, as well as some dinosaur prints and giant cat footprints, all quite obviously originating from George Adams. Burdick even traced the slabs back to a knick-knack shop in Glen Rose that was known to flip George's carvings. So Taylor meets Burdick, sees these slabs, asks around, and puts it all together. They're carvings. But he's open to the possibility that the Mantracks are replicas of genuine prints from the past. So Taylor focuses on the river and conducts his own original excavation. Taylor was a reverend and filmmaker, so he wasn't at all trained or qualified to be doing this, but with the support of the old-timers like Charlie Moss and James Riles, Taylor and his volunteer crew from the Lubbock, Texas Bible Church were able to make a genuine discovery. The Taylor Trail is relevant enough to be listed on Google Maps. What drew Taylor to this run of prints is that it heavily featured the poor, elongated tracks that paleontologists would typically write off. When you look at the trackway as a whole, it's obvious that dinosaurs left the prints, but a few individual prints bear enough of a resemblance to a human print to satisfy Taylor. The excavation was captured on 16mm film and combined with interviews and a few random set pieces to create the documentary Footprints in Stone.
Paluxy, revealer of history, oh, what is this mystery of footprints in stone? Did man and dinosaur roam on your ancient shore? River Paluxy, revealer of history.
Released in January 1973, this film had essentially become lost media until a quite damaged and extremely faded copy surfaced online in 2023. The documentary is amateurish, bumbling, comically inept, and, well, bad. Contemporary reviews of the film painted it as incompetent even for a low-budget doc from that era. The camera gets as close to the titular Footprints in Stone as it can, but Stan and his son Paul, working the camera, are severely limited by their equipment, mostly showing blobby tracks in wide shots rendered further illegible to contemporary viewers through the poor quality of most projections. Due to those limitations and the general challenge of photographing the bright limestone along the Paluxy, the crew make heavy use of movie magic, using water and oil to essentially paint the feet into the depressions to better sell them to the camera. To put on my filmmaker hat for a moment here, the resolution that they're working with in terms of dynamic range and detail means that this wetting overwhelms all other considerations. The surface of the rock is so flattened by the photography that whatever Stan chooses to paint onto the rock becomes the only thing that you can make out. It's quite manipulative. But despite that, Taylor was clearly making an effort at doing legitimate work here, and makes the savvy decision to omit the carved footprints entirely. Instead, Taylor leans heavily on the testimonies of the old-timers. The problem is that many of the key players were either incredibly old or incredibly dead, so Taylor's interviews with them feature very dubious claims.
Now, I do know there are quite a few people, I think, that are real reliable people that said when they were younger, 40 and 50 and 60 years ago, that there were tracks here in the river and they saw them, and they certainly, if they weren't human tracks, they couldn't tell it.
They wasn't a human print. I have never been able to figure out what they were.
You saw them right along with dinosaur footprints.
Well, I've seen them all together and right along down, and at that time I have seen them where the man would step in the dinosaur's print after he'd passed over. Some of them were bound to wear some kind of moccasins in the track they made. Some of them had to be barefooted because the mud had come up between their toes.
Now, did you count 5 toes?
Sure, just naturally as my own foot.
Was there an arch in the foot?
Just a very slightly arch.
So there you go. Evolution debunked. The film also features interviews with various creationists, including Clifford Burdick and Genesis flood author Henry Morris. But notably, there was not a singular secular voice in the film. The only skeptics included were old Earth creationists. So even the dissent was toothless. Footprints in Stone became a core text for creationist organizations. The film was screened at churches all across the United States. It could be rented through mail order for $30, but if you were playing the film for a secular public school, they'd loan it to you for free. Given that this was a 16mm film distributed by mail order, the rollout of Footprints in Stone was slow, but its influence is undeniable.
Both skeptic and believer have come from far and wide to peer into your waters and stand in awed surprise. Could man have lived at that time when dinosaurs walked here? Then geologic tables are incorrect, I fear.
Throughout all of this, from the 50s to the 80s, Glen Rose had become an obscure tourist destination for fundamentalist pilgrims. Back in the 40s, Emmett McFall bought land on the Paluxy River and erected a sign offering the curious a tour of the dinosaur and giant Mantracks on his property. Prior to his death in 1959, George Adams would still carve the odd footprint. This slab, produced sometime in the early 50s, is probably his best work. It has some problems, but it's a night and day improvement on his work 25 years prior. At some point, the influx of Mantrack pilgrims became too much for Ernest Adams. The story goes that Ernest ordered the local merchants to spread the word that all human tracks were fake. This isn't framed as a confession or anything of that sort, but instead as him protecting his small town from the world's attention. That didn't do much to dispel rumors and only muddied matters further. Despite decades of excavations producing no documentation of Mantracks as well defined as the carvings, the oblong tracks being uncovered were convincing enough for tourists to accept the testimonies of old-timers and send them home satisfied. If they could find this in an afternoon, perfect human prints are certainly under there somewhere. By 1980, the buzz around these footprints in the Paluxy riverbed was beginning to bleed out of evangelical circles and catch the attention of secularists, or at least people not already immersed in the niche politics of young Earth creationism. One such individual was Glenn Cuban, then recent biology graduate who, in his own words, was leaning towards strict creationism and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Quick sidebar here, but while Glenn's entrance into this story is seemingly unremarkable, he sticks around and does just an absolutely tremendous amount of work, both primary research and just collating and documenting what everybody else was up to for going on 40 years now. Indeed, this whole story would be very difficult to tell if not for the foundation laid by Glenn. To Glenn, the claim of fossilized human footprints would be huge if true, but on arrival it clearly wasn't. As Glen saw it, this whole thing was seemingly just a big misunderstanding. These lay people had a clear interest in the footprints, like him, but had absolutely no familiarity with the subject. Tourists were turning up at the river and just kind of wandering, maybe getting a local to show them around. So maybe if Glen helped get accessible explanations on topics like erosion and dinosaur footprints out into the world, that could help clear this whole thing up. But then Carl Baugh arrived in Glen Rose. Baugh is your classic charlatan. We know very little about his life prior to arriving in Glen Rose, and what we do know is contradictory and full of holes. Back in 1996, Kayla Henry did a profile of Baugh for the Dallas Observer, and despite the article's clear deference to the creationist argument, she can't pin much down about Baugh before he arrives in Glen Rose.
Only one thing about Baugh's academic history can be established with any certainty. In 1959, he earned a 3-year Graduate of Theology degree from then unaccredited Baptist Bible College in Springfield, Missouri. The rest of his purported academic credentials appear to be flimsy correspondence course degrees, and even these have changed between books and articles written by Baugh.
Baugh was lured to Glen Rose by the Genesis flood and footprints in stone, and he immediately got digging. He first made his presence known on June 16, 1982, when he invited reporters from Fort Worth and Dallas to witness the discovery of 24 Tyrannosaurus prints and various new Mantracks. A lot of this history was preserved by Ronnie Hastings, a Texan high school physics teacher who lived close to Glen Rose. He caught wind of Baugh's announcement and attended the excavation alongside the media. This began what would be an almost 3-year-long documentation of Baugh's activities in Glen Rose. Hastings noted that Baugh's crew, like Taylor's, were volunteers from local church groups, but he noted that these volunteers took far more care in their work than Baugh himself. Carl Baugh was quick to draw conclusions and quick to pivot. He had no issue contradicting himself and had no issue playing games with skeptics. He could see toe marks on the track. If you can't see them, that's a skill issue.
Within the side of the dinosaur track, actually the human footprint comes over to right here. Now, I'm going to wet my foot and step down in that. And I think it should even be plainer then.
Okay, so we need to stop for a second and really point out how absurd this whole thing has been. Paleontology, or in this case paleoichnology, the study of trace fossils, is an exceptionally complex field, combining the already complicated topics of geology, biology, and in our case, anatomy. But throughout this entire saga, the Mantrack phenomenon has been driven by individuals with absolutely no experience in this field. It's been local farmers, filmmakers, and tourists all making shockingly confident identifications of trace fossils. And some of the claims they wrote are just nonsense. In this Moral Majority Report article from 1985, the author claims that the footprints are so well preserved because they were buried rapidly by Noah's flood. We've already covered that violent floods can literally rip apart the stone riverbed. The original mud prints had to be buried gently to avoid being washed away. The quality of the prints opposes the flood narrative. It does not support it. But don't think that it was just creationists running their mouth about this. The most absurd claim we found came from an atheist skeptic.
It seems obvious that pranksters intent on faking the evidence tished up their pant legs and had a good time paddling around in bare feet in the soft limestone in order to make it appear that both humans and dinosaurs walked the earth at the same ancient time.
The soft limestone. This is just rowdy teenagers stomping around, punching 4-inch deep holes in the rock. This incompetence can also be seen in the work of Taylor and Baugh's respective digs. Neither excavation cleaned up after themselves, leaving the site littered with trash. Stanley Taylor attempted to do a legitimate excavation, including the full field documentation that had been universally absent since Bird left. But Taylor had no idea what he was doing, so even the most basic exercises stumped him. Taylor's measurements were wildly inaccurate, which he seemed to be aware of. Even individual footprints were getting approximate measurements, because he lacked the confidence to make a decisive measurement. Observational errors of a similar magnitude were found throughout his work. Needless to say, these errors taint Taylor's analysis and render his conclusions worthless. So if Stanley Taylor's excavation of a genuine trackway was such a debacle in spite of his best efforts, what hope do you and I have just vibe checking the riverbed? Limestone is notoriously deceptive when it comes to trackways. River erosion produces intricate surfaces with numerous depressions. One major example is carron weathering, a chemical reaction that produces cavities that can be misinterpreted as toe marks. In terms of erosion of the dinosaur prints themselves, there are too many factors to even name. You have the erosion that occurs when the lime mud is fresh, where mud will collapse in on itself or the print will just begin to fall apart as the tide comes in, and that erosion is entirely separate from the erosion that occurs once the track is unearthed as limestone 100 million years later. Then there's the weird curveballs. The track maker could have slipped in the mud. You might be dealing with an under track where the lime mud was already buried under clay or algae, giving you a softer, shallower print. Or maybe you're looking at the burrow of an ancient shrimp. That one has tricked Baugh a few times. So the paleontologist has all of these factors to consider while typically lacking the most crucial detail. What made the track? It's rare to know what species or even genus you're dealing with. So yeah, when Roland Bird was shown a vague footprint that lacked all definition, as a scientist he did just kind of have to shrug and move on to the next track. Individual tracks, especially poor tracks, aren't good for much, but when you have a series of them, the paleontologist can start to piece it all together. We've already done this. The Taylor Trail featured elongated tracks that were very appealing to our human pattern recognizing brains, but in the context of the whole trail, those are just one-off weird prints. So it should be clear by now why statements like this hurt so badly.
The tracks were clear. I remember how the skin between the little toe and the one next to it had grown together on the right foot.
There are more layers to this than the Glen Rose Formation itself. Charlie Moss was a bootlegger and pecan farmer who is quoted here making a perfect ID on a human footprint he saw over half a century prior, where he has presumed a deformity in the trackmaker's anatomy to explain a defect. The same behavior can be seen from Jim Hall when he attended Carl Baugh's expedition in 1985. Hall spoke about finding skid marks where a person had almost slipped in the mud. Carl Baugh has continued to carry out annual expeditions to the Paluxy riverbed even through to today. For the low price of $15 per person per day, you too can help Carl Baugh unlock the secrets of the ancient world. You will need to bring your own equipment. Carl recommends several tools, but creative substitution is encouraged. Guests are invited to bring their imagination with them to the river and find a story in the rock.
Okay, the outside of the track is here. The digit goes around like that, but it's still infilled. The central digit goes like that, but it's infilled. The near digit goes that far, but it's infilled. We swing around, and this is the hallux back of the foot. So here's the outline of this little juvenile track. But it still needs to weather. It's a beautiful little thing. And it's a continuation of that trail.
Is that an accurate identification of an Acrocanthosaurus track? How should I know? Do you have any idea how difficult all this is? When Carl Baugh arrived in Glen Rose, he represented a seismic shift in this whole thing. Where Taylor and Burdick sought actual respectability, Carl immediately began pumping out a constant stream of disinformation. When he began his excavations in Glen Rose, he was seemingly completely clueless when it came to dinosaurs. His early footprints were erroneously credited to Tyrannosaurus and Brontosaurus, seemingly because of the Sinclair fiberglass models beside the parking lot. Baugh's 1982 excavation was a barrage of claims fired at Ronnie Hastings, but one in particular foreshadowed what was to come. On October 20th, 1982, Baugh brought out a cigar box and showed Hastings his best evidence of a young Earth, the London Hammer. This would be the first of a vast collection of out-of-place artifacts. As the name implies, these are artifacts that are made noteworthy specifically because of the context in which they are found appearing out of place. The London hammer is a great example of how these supposed artifacts are used. The hammer was supposedly found completely encased in Cretaceous rock. Therefore, the hammer is as old as the dinosaur tracks, therefore humans and dinosaurs. However, there is no documentation of where the hammer was found, and the story of its discovery keeps changing. Baugh today says it was unearthed completely encased, but other accounts had the handle either sticking out from a rock nodule or even just found loose by a creek. If that were the case, the hammer being embedded in a limey matrix like this isn't shocking. But the magic of out-of-place artifacts is that the critical context can always be withheld or distorted. Every one of Baugh's artifacts or fossils comes into his possession years and often decades after their discovery. In many cases, there will be numerous tests that could be carried out to verify the authenticity of his artifacts, but Baugh refuses to have them done. Rather than bring in qualified third parties to carry out mainstream analysis of the hammer, Baugh instead carries out his own crank experiments, with spiral CT scans being a particular favorite. Typically, these CT scans are carried out by medical technicians who seemingly have no idea what they're doing. Our favorite example of this is Baugh's fossilized human finger.
One of the more intriguing and gratifying of these original artifacts, owned by the Creation Evidence Museum, is a little finger.
In that moral majority story with Jim Hall, Hall says that we've got enough human footprints. We're good for footprints. The next step is to find fossilized human remains in this strata. And almost immediately, Baugh comes across this fossilized human finger that was discovered on the Paluxy. What a coincidence. It's just an interestingly shaped rock, but that hasn't stopped Baugh from making all sorts of insane claims about it.
This particular finger has been analyzed, first of all, by spiral CAT scan. It's been demonstrated to be genuine. That is, we have the distal, the medial, and the proximal joints showing with spiral CAT scan. We have the actual bone being read by spiral CAT scan. We have the actual cartilaginous ligaments being read by spiral CAT scan. But that isn't all. We have the fingernail and the cuticle and the taper read by spiral CAT scan.
The scan has a darker area towards the center because that's the point with the greatest amount of rock for the radiation to pass through, but it kinda vaguely looks like what you imagine your bone would look like, so that's Baugh's angle. Incidentally, Glenn Kubin received an email from a woman in 2012 claiming that she was the one to discover the stone. She told Glenn that she lent it to Carl to be returned soon after, but Carl just stole it, refusing to give it back to her for almost 30 years at that point. Carl Baugh assembled a collection of these artifacts so rapidly that he found himself wanting for somewhere to put it all.
But perhaps equally fascinating is the roadside attraction to be found on the parcel of land at the very mouth, the very gate to the state park itself. Occupied by a fundamentalist Christian creationist, the Creationist Evidences Museum is a tiny complex of trailer houses and other debris that act like a tourist trap magnet on many unsuspecting park visitors. For a few dollars, a loner or a whole family can enjoy the hilarious misinformation and fiction on exhibit in the museum.
Originally a double-wide trailer, it has since been expanded into a larger permanent structure. We have, of course, the aforementioned London hammer and fossilized finger. The Moab skeleton that Burdick pushed for over a decade? Baugh was the guy who bought it in 1983, and he displayed it in the museum at least until the early 90s. On my trip to Glen Rose, I was unable to locate the artifact in the museum, but I was able to have a brief interaction with Baugh as he was on his way out for lunch. I asked him if I had just missed it somewhere in the chaos or if it was in storage. He told me, in a very cagey tone, that there is some evidence that the artifact might be intrusive, and in the interest of the truth, they had decided to remove it from display. He also insisted repeatedly that it's not in storage, but in security, though admittedly the difference between those is lost on me. On a tour of the newest addition to the museum, a Potemkin laboratory where two volunteers cosplay as scientists, we were shown two pieces of coprolite, aka fossilized excrement, and told that one was two snakes fighting and the other was a baby dinosaur who had just hatched and was, quote, cowering in fear because it saw the flood coming. And how could I forget Carl's hyperbaric chamber? This piece of cutting-edge technology began construction in the early 1990s. It's a structure so important to Baugh that this entire building was erected around it. The chamber recreates the atmospheric and electromagnetic conditions of the pre-flood Earth. This will cause any organisms placed in the chamber to rapidly return to their pre-flood forms. Lizards will become Edenic dinosaurs in just a few generations. Okay, so Carl has like 3 hyperbaric chambers, 2 small ones and a huge one. Back in the 90s, he put a copperhead snake in one of the small ones for 3 weeks and milked it for venom both before and after. Carl's claim is that they sent the venom to a secular scientist who said that the venom had transformed into serum. Now that claim is just kind of nonsense, built on the fact that serum and venom sound alike, and thus the listener might infer for themselves that serum is the opposite of venom. But setting that aside, this is at least an actual experiment. This is the hard science that has eluded creationism for so long. The main problem is that that earlier chamber was too small. You can't run an experiment with live animals for longer than a few days for mammals, maybe a few weeks for reptiles. Hence, Carl's massive chamber that is intended to contain a fully self-sustaining ecosystem simulating pre-flood Earth. It will provide irrefutable proof against Darwinian evolution and the geologic timeline, and Carl Baugh will be recognized for the 30-plus years of work it took to bring this all to fruition. It's empty.
Assuming this theory to be accurate, it is furthermore the producer's assumption that this hyperbaric biosphere has been left intact only because it would be prohibitively expensive to have it hauled away and too difficult to dispose of by oneself.
But in the early days, when the museum was still just a trailer, Carl's marquee attraction was Clifford Burdick's footprint. An elderly Burdick had returned to Glen Rose in 1983, and Baugh had convinced Clifford to sell him one of his slabs, the so-named Burdick Right, now conspicuously split in 2. Though make mental note of the fact that all my footage of the print is split into even more pieces. Why was it split in 2? Because over a decade earlier, in the 70s, a team of scientists from Columbia Union College and Loma Linda University conducted an investigation into the loose slabs carved by George Adams. They'd collected as many slabs as they could get their hands on and sectioned them to determine if they were natural depressions. They concluded that Burdick's prints were likely carved. It would be hard for Baugh not to know of this study. They weren't subtle in their work. But over the decades, Baugh has assembled a truly absurd number of these things. None are more meaningful than any other, and they all share the same key traits. First of all, they all crop up out of nowhere with a wafting story about being found years, if not decades earlier by a friend of a friend of a friend. This makes tracing the prints basically impossible. It also helps justify the complete lack of documentation. Second, very few photos of these prints are in wide circulation, with the most prominent being constrained to only the best angles. Now, from a good angle, these tracks look more compelling, but it's still possible to debunk them. The AM Coffee print is a perfectly flat depression with an overly straight instep. The Willett print has monstrous toes that imply that the person's strongest toe was this middle one, and the Zapata print has freakish proportions on the ball and through the arch. But really, it needs to be stressed how unconvincing these prints are in person. When you see these in person from the bad angles, the idea that these are trace fossils is just comical. Like seriously, you can see the tool marks. George did what he could, but you can see the tool marks. What are we doing here? But the true masterpiece in Baugh's collection is this, the Delk print. Originally discovered in July of 2000, this piece of paleontologic perfection was found on the Paluxy River by amateur archaeologist Alvis Delk. The slab was supposedly found loose in a pile of rocks along the creek that flows into the river. Delk took the slab home, thinking that it only contained the tridactyl dinosaur print. It wasn't until May of 2008, when Delk suffered a bad fall from a ladder and needed money for medical bills, that he brushed up the specimen and noticed the human print. As an archaeologist, recognizing that this represented comically definitive evidence of the coexistence of man and dinosaur, explicitly disproving Darwinian evolution and changing world history, Delk did the obvious thing and sold the specimen to the crank who runs a roadside attraction outside town. Never mind the fact that Delk's archaeological experience came from attending Baugh's annual digs. But who cares? Let's just marvel at this thing. It's so good. Carl Baugh has called the human print an ideal specimen, ignoring the obvious anthropomorphic flaws. The big toe is 2 miles deep, the 2 middle toes are far too long and splayed out like God only knows what, and we have a razor-sharp instep. Viewed from a more acute angle, the footprint turns into clearly impossible nonsense. But we have a whole second print to analyze, and this juvenile Acrocanthosaurus print has its own problems. When you contrast it with a genuine Juviacro track, the difference becomes fairly obvious. The digits are too short, the depression on the hole is too flat, lacking any indication of claw marks that often appear so pronounced. What it better resembles is, of course, a carving. You can just see the layers that Delk carved through with your eyes. But what makes the Delk print so magical is just how brazen it is. A perfect acro track over the top of an ideal human track on a Cretaceous limestone slab found on the Paluxy River and layered specifically so that the human track would have had to predate the dinosaur track. It's hard to dream of a more spectacular specimen. It's like forging your report card and giving yourself all A double pluses with a bonus note that you are indeed very handsome and a generous lover. I love it so much. By the early 1980s, Mantrack mania had peaked. Stanley Taylor and Henry Morris had passed their torches to their respective sons, who continued to push the Mantrack claim, albeit with some increasing timidity. By late 1985, Glenn Kubin and Ronnie Hastings were working with a small team of secular academics. Glenn had assembled his own massive body of work debunking the Mantrack claims on the Taylor Trail, while the rest of the team put together a 68-page special edition of the Creation Evolution Journal, focusing solely on the Paluxy River's Mantracks. It debunked misinformation surrounding the anatomy, geology, and anthropology of Mantracks, among other things. Today, the authors would just drop this article like a bomb, but Glenn Kubin invited Paul Taylor and John Morris down to the Paluxy River to reevaluate their claims, challenge Glenn, and really just get their story straight. And in a turn of events that would never ever happen today, Taylor and Morris came to the river in good faith. They already had concerns about the quality of the work the creationists had carried out, they accepted the evidence against the Mantracks, and they took steps to fix the situation. John Morris ceased publication of his 1980 book advocating for the Paluxy Mantracks, and as Glenn Kubin understands it, Paul Taylor straight up destroyed all copies of Footprints in Stone. John Morris released a carefully worded statement that stopped short of a full retraction, but he hits all the necessary beats to earn full credit. All the existing tracks in the riverbed were made by dinosaurs, the old-timers' testimonies are questionable, creationism can't rely on the Paluxy River for evidence of a young Earth.
Several years ago when I spoke at ICR, and I said, John, why did you withdraw your book? He no longer sells the book. He says, Brother Hovind, I've got a whole warehouse full of those books, and I'd love to be able to sell them. He said, but I just cannot in good conscience continue to support the footprint idea in Texas. There was a movie made called Footprints in Stone. That movie went around the circuit for a while, showing the dinosaur and human footprints together, and then they withdrew their movie off the market. So you'll get some people who will give you some flack and say, oh, the creationists don't support those human footprint ideas anymore. Well,
people like Hovind and Baugh took the wrong lesson from all of this. Never compromise, never apologize, never retract, or else you'll end up with warehouses full of books you cannot in good conscience continue to sell. Carl Baugh flip-flopped on accepting the secular evidence, though ultimately rejected it, and he has continued to promote Mantracks for the past 40 years. Baugh was always on the fringes of these creationist organizations, but this has made him radioactive even to his most extreme creationist peers.
Dr. Carl Baugh is a noted scientist and researcher. He joins Kenneth Copeland for an extraordinary videotape teaching series, Evidences for Creation.
Creationism is a philosophy, but it's also a product. While sectarian infighting is older than the young Earth even thinks it could be, creationist infighting today is dominated by commercial interests. While Clifford Burdick spent his entire career tied up in young Earth creationism simply for the love of the game, the modern creationist movement is dominated by books, the lecture circuit, homeschooling resources, and attractions like creation museums. Answers in Genesis is a young Earth creationist organization founded and operated by Ken Ham. AIG is best known for its creation museum in Kentucky and companion Ark experience, the gold standard of their genre. Creationist museums were a response to creationism's continued inability to break into public schools. After decades of failure, these organizations decided that if they can't bring creationism to the children should be brought to the creationism. This dovetails with homeschooling, the other major compromise the creationists had to settle for. These museums may be one of the only excursions that homeschooled fundamentalist kids ever see. Museums like Ken Ham's and the ICR's Discovery Center here in Dallas are both the product of decades of creationists mastering the art of proselytizing with a secular costume. Here, they can control both sides of the message and use the language of museums to create propaganda with a relatively deft hand. The ICR Discovery Center is a slick operation, a large glass and stone building in Dallas that plays the part of a museum well, even as the corner cutting makes itself obvious.
That's just cardboard. It's printed on cardboard. Oh my god. The world's tiniest stegosaurus. Tiny stego.
By contrast, Carl Baugh's collection of random junk, including utterly unrelated ephemera like a 10-foot tall statue of former Dallas Cowboys coach Tom Landry, is so shameless and so sloppy that it offends people like Ken Ham on a deep level. Despite ostensibly being allies, Ken Ham has been attacking Baugh's claims and his credibility for over 20 years. While these groups are allies in a political sense, that spirit of cooperation is in tension. They are courting the same increasingly insular audience, competing to sell them their books, their lecture series, and tickets to their museums. But from the outside, they appear homogenous. So if Carl is an embarrassment who claims that velociraptors were designed by God to cut grass in the Garden of Eden, then it makes everyone look bad.
These are velociraptors. Models of velociraptors, and it's that claw that gives them the reputation of having sickles that would just cut your gut out, you know.
Right, well, that's what we've seen in the movies.
Well, yes, but in reality, that's not the case. In the fossil record, we have canes that grew, that today, like the Lycopsid club moss, is 18 inches, but in the fossil record, 120 feet tall. To harvest those would require a sickle built in. And if you didn't harvest them, they take over the entire landscape.
So there was a creature that God created that had that sickle built in,
Yes.
and that would also help keep the canes in check.
It's the balance in nature.
But at the core, all of them are peddling variations of the same bundle of misinformation in a very literal sense. After publishing The Genesis Flood, Henry Morris goes on to found the Institute for Creation Research. Ken Ham, who was raised in the nascent creationist movement in Australia, comes across a copy of the book while he's in university in the 70s, and it fully radicalizes him. He moves to the US in 1987 to work for the ICR before breaking away to form the organization that would become Answers in Genesis in 1993. And as we already discussed, The Genesis Flood is the book that convinced Baugh to move to Texas in the first place. So Ham and Morris warning people to stay away from Baugh's fraudulent artifacts while sharing his claim that Noah brought dinosaurs onto the ark is creating a difference without distinction. The thing Baugh understood, before any of the rest of them, is that if you deal with scientists in good faith, you will be humiliated. You will have to make retractions. You will lose. So just keep your head down and plow right on through. The Burdick track was cut in half by Loma Linda in the 70s, a decade before Baugh bought it, and then somewhere along the way, it was cut into even more pieces, for even more tests that even more confirmed it was even more just a carving. And it doesn't matter. The thing has been a known carving since Burdick acquired it in the 50s, and there it is, in Baugh's museum, where it's gonna sit forever. Baugh may be a pariah on the fringes of an already fringe belief, but he cracked the meta in the 80s. People have been making fun of his unfinished hyperbaric chamber being a year or two away from operation for as long as it has existed. He was posting through it before posting was even invented. Morris and Ham have way more in common with Baugh than they would like to admit. They conflict with him on a personal level, find his displays cheap and sensationalist because, well, they are, but they have wholly adopted science as performance. Will they do a better job with the cosplay? Their research institutes are larger and better equipped, and their websites do a lot of posturing about data and research. They are ultimately playing Baugh's game. Never compromise, never apologize, never retract. Part of that cosplay is, of course, the performance of being led by data, but maybe it goes without saying, that's just not true. These organizations, performing as researchers and scientists, must walk a very silly wire. The 50th anniversary edition of the Genesis Flood hasn't been updated in over 49 printings, but, why would it be? It doesn't matter. If you get a copy today, the Gallup slab material, the stuff that cites Burdick citing Bird, stuff that's been debunked for 50 years, sits entirely unchanged. The book doesn't need revisions, it doesn't need updates, it doesn't need to change with changing data. In fact, to do so would be counter to the purpose of its existence. The fact that science is constantly shifting with new data, new findings, new insights, is the very thing that the audience for the Genesis Flood sees as a weakness, sees as proof that science is untrustworthy. So naturally, a science textbook for anti-science must never change. And so we come back to Baugh, to his silly roadside attraction with its silly pretend laboratory and his pile of fake artifacts. Mantracks may be fake artifacts, but they are still artifacts. They are not the imprint of human feet left in ancient lime mud, but they are a human imprint. Sure, they're a trivial curiosity, a sideshow of crank science, even amongst the crank science of young Earth creationism, but within that, they are this fascinating, weird, quirky, anthropological artifact. I love Mantracks. Really, what an amazing hoax that has managed to just keep chugging for so long, kept alive into the 21st century almost entirely by one man. As a connoisseur of fakes, frauds, and scams, I firmly believe that the Delk print and Burdick Wright belong in a museum, but displayed for what they are, not what they claim to be. When I visited Baugh's shack, I was giddy to finally see them in person with my own eyes. What amazing relics of the absolute hot mess we call humanity. The fact that there are so many of them has a perverse beauty to it. They are silly, wholly unpersuasive to anyone who isn't thirsty to be persuaded, but there are people thirsty to be persuaded, and so cropped up the niche trade of producing fake fossils to sell to Carl Baugh. Ultimately, the Mantracks are little more than a footnote in the history of Glen Rose, an oddity from almost a century ago that has persisted, drawing in all manner of odd characters over the years. But Glen Rose isn't the Mantracks capital of Texas, it's the dinosaur capital of Texas. The town has embraced this identity. Dinosaurs are everywhere in Glen Rose because dinosaurs, the footprints they left, are literally the bedrock the town sits on. In 1968, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department acquired 347 acres of land surrounding the Paluxy River to convert into a state park. The park's signature attractions are these massive fiberglass sculptures named Rex and Bronto. These were among a number of life-size sculptures commissioned by Sinclair Oil as part of their Dino Land exhibit at the 1964 New York World Fair. Sinclair Oil was the key financier to the American Museum of Natural History, and they partially financed Bird's sauropod excavation in 1940. Sinclair would end up donating these sculptures to the state park in time for its grand opening. The Dinosaur Valley State Park opened to the public in October of 1970. Roland Bird was present at the opening, returning to the old stomping ground for the first time in 30 years. The state park has been credited to Bird, it's been credited to the politicians who signed it into legal existence, and those are fair achievements. It is their legacy. But it's also the legacy of Glen Rose itself and its cast of misfits and weirdos. James and Cecil Riles chiseling footprints out of the bedrock with an old car axle. Charlie Moss and Ernest Adams discovering Texanus gargantuus on the riverbed. And George Adams, the mailman, sitting under a tree, carving a footprint into a slab that would wind its way to a trading post in New Mexico.